is a telephone town hall with Green Party leader Elizabeth May, the second in the 2019 Leaders Series hosted by Friends of Canadian Broadcasting. In fact, I'd like now to welcome Daniel Bernhard, Executive Director of Friends of Canadian Broadcasting, to say just a little more about the Leaders Series and the reason we are here today. Daniel.
Merci, Francine, and thank you so much to everyone on the call today. It's a pleasure to be here in our second installment of our 2019 Leader Series with Green Party leader Elizabeth May. For those of you who are just joining the call, welcome. If you are interested in asking a question to Ms. May, please press *3 and an operator will take your questions. As we did in 2015, Friends has invited all of the major party leaders to speak directly with our supporters about CBC, journalism, democracy, Canadian content, and other related issues. To date, NDP leader Jagmeet Singh and Green Party leader Elizabeth May have confirmed their participation. Liberal leader Justin Trudeau and Conservative leader Andrew Scheer have not yet responded to our invitations, though I hope they will soon. I know that everyone is itching to get to Ms. May, but while we wait for people to connect to this call, I'd just like to say a little bit more about Friends' priorities for this upcoming election. Canadian journalism is in deep trouble. In the past decade, 16,000 journalists have been laid off. 250 media outlets have closed, and at the same time, CBC remains among the most poorly funded public broadcasters in the developed world. It's hardly equipped to pick up the slack. And when journalism suffers, so too does democracy. It should therefore come as little surprise that Canada's number one news source is no longer CBC. In fact, it's not even Canadian, it's Facebook. The problem, of course, and there are many, but the principal problem is that Facebook has no legal obligation to tell the truth. They spread hate and propaganda with complete impunity, not to mention that they pay no taxes here. And while they are siphoning billions of advertising dollars away from Canadian media, they do not employ a single journalist here in Canada. To make matters worse, Ottawa actually subsidizes the likes of Facebook with $1.6 billion public dollars every year, thanks to a loophole in the Income Tax Act. Now, Friends supporters across the country are telling their candidates that we expect and we deserve better. It's time to end big tech's free ride. It's time to end the subsidies for U.S. tech companies like Facebook that poison our democracy. It's time to level the playing field for quality Canadian journalism. And most importantly, it's time to restore CBC, especially the news budget, so we can tell great Canadian stories. Friends supporters across Canada have been putting up lawn signs and telling their politicians that we choose Canada. And if you want our votes, you should too. I've personally been to packed events this past week in Peterborough, Ontario, in Oakville, London, Waterloo. We've had events in Kelowna, Surrey, Calgary, Edmonton. Our supporters are really throughout the country, and they are working hard. So those are our priorities for this election campaign. This is a great opportunity to ask your questions to Ms. May. Pour les francophones parmi nous, je viens d'exprimer les enjeux principaux de notre campagne électorale. Rendez-nous visite chez annousdechoisir.ca pour en apprendre plus de nos priorités. Et n'oubliez pas de signer la pétition. Si vous avez des questions, appuyez le étoile 3, *3 for questions. Over to you, Francine. Thank you.
Merci, Daniel. For those of you just joining us, this is a special telephone town hall discussion with Green Party leader Elizabeth May. You'll get a chance to ask Ms. May your questions about CBC, Canadian journalism, Canadian democracy. We'll also be asking you a few key questions concerning Canadian media. Now, here's how to ask your question. If you are on the phone, press *3. An operator will take down your question and put it in line so that you can ask your question to Ms. May. For those of you joining online, please type your question into the message box. Now, before we officially begin, let me take a moment, first of all, to welcome Elizabeth May, who's joining us from Sydney, BC. Hello, Madame May. Thank you very much for participating in this town hall today.
Very happy to join you, and merci beaucoup, Madame Pelletier, pour votre rôle ici comme modérateur. Very happy to join the telephone town hall for Friends of Public Broadcasting.
Merci à vous. I will take this opportunity to start the ball rolling by asking a first question. And I would like to know, Madame May, concerning your platform. Your platform, the Green Party platform, is by far the most generous in terms of funding the CBC and Radio-Canada. We know that the amount given to CBC has been an ongoing debate for many years in this country. Why do you think CBC should get increased funding of $315 million per year starting now?
Thank you so much. Actually, I want to make a small correction. When we actually finished budgeting everything based on the Parliamentary Budget Office analysis, it's around $300 million per year, every year, and $300 million every year is based on making sure that Canadian public broadcasting is funded per capita at least the same amount as the BBC in the United Kingdom. So that's basically been our benchmark. Where we think that's absolutely reasonable. Why should Canadians have a public broadcaster, and as Danielle Bernhardt said in the opening, that's so poorly funded, struggling? And we are big supporters of public broadcasting in the Green Party of Canada. I mean, given some of our CBC coverage, I'd have to say the CBC is not a big supporter of us, but we support the CBC, and we will continue to do so. It's essential in a healthy democracy to have access to a public broadcaster, and our commitment isn't just in the $300 million per year over the next 5 years. It's also in some of the other areas that undermine CBC. I don't know if any other party has made this point, but we want to reform the governance structure of CBC. I should have said CBC et aussi Radio-Canada, of CBC and Radio-Canada, to remove the potential for political interference in appointments to the board of directors of CBC and Radio-Canada. So our commitment is full on, and we can pay for it, and we're determined to see it happen. And depending on how many Green members of Parliament there are after October 21st, every additional Green MP elected is another strong voice and push and vote for proper funding of our national public broadcaster.
I will probably come back later to ask you how you expect to pay for that amount of increase. It's a sizable increase, but thank you for your answer. And before we begin, let me remind you again that this is a telephone town hall with Green Party leader Elizabeth May. And if you have a question, you just press *3 on your phone at any point during the call. An operator will take down your question and put you in line to ask your question. Vous pouvez poser vos questions à Madame May en appuyant l'étoile, ensuite le numéro 3. Si vous posez la question en français, Madame May se fera un plaisir de vous répondre en français. Just before we start, and we can see that the lines are buzzing now, I would like to ask you, our audience, people at home listening, a quick question. This is our first poll question. Would you change your vote because of a party's position on the CBC and Canadian media? Press 1 on your phone to answer yes. Press 2 on your phone to answer no. Let me repeat the question. Would you change your vote because of a party's position on the CBC and Canadian media? Press 1 for yes, press 2 for no. Thanks for letting us know what you think. We'll report back on the poll results in a few minutes. Now, again, one last reminder, just press *3 on your phone to get in line to ask a question to Elizabeth May. An operator will take down your question and put you in line. I think it is time to begin, and our first question comes from Frances. She's in Ottawa, and her question concerns empowering the CBC. Frances, would you please ask your question?
Yes, my concern is that the CBC, the public broadcaster in Canada, it has the lowest number of funds of any public broadcaster around the world. My husband was a documentary producer with Sunday Morning for many years, at a time when when the CBC was funded adequately. They were able to send journalists all around the world. This is something that rarely happens now, and I think increased funding is an absolutely essential thing if we are, in fact, going to have quality public broadcasting in Canada. I want to know what the Green Party will do.
Thank you. I think Ms. May partly answered the question, but Madame May, would you like to add to what you said earlier?
Absolutely. I thank Francis for the question. Our budget is, we're the only party so far to have made our full budget public with the background work that goes with it in terms of where we find the revenue. We're making an unequivocal commitment to fund the CBC and Radio-Canada by an additional $300 million per year until the per capita level of funding will be the equal of that of the BBC and the commitment of the UK government. It's all of us, well, I'm 65, so I remember when CBC Radio never had to keep repeating the same shows over and over, where we had journalists going out and doing documentaries, where we actually, as you said, Francis, when there was the funding to send people overseas to bring back news to Canadians that was in-depth, thoughtful, and really kept us one of the most informed peoples on earth. And the cuts to CBC have made a difference. We can see it. We can feel it. We need to restore the excellence of CBC journalism because public broadcasting is essential and journalism is essential in a healthy democracy.
May I just ask you, because it is a quite sizable increase, you're proposing to go from $34 per person per year, which is what we right now the CBC Radio-Canada is receiving, to eventually $100 per person per year as the CBC does. Where would you get the money?
Well, it's a very good question, and one of the ways we do it is answering another one of the current strange subsidies, inadvertent subsidies to Facebook and Google. The reality is that social media platforms you can, as a Canadian, business or enterprise of any kind, you can place your advertising on those social media platforms and avoid the taxation on advertising that occurs on Canadian publications. So this is absolutely bizarre. That comes to a significant amount of money. So closing that loophole really matters. We would also, of course, we are looking for revenue for a whole lot of important social programs. So the funding for CBC obviously pales in comparison to the funding to bring in universal pharmacare. We're committed to doing that. We're committed to eliminating tuition for post-secondary institutions, whether colleges or universities. We're committed to debt forgiveness for students owing money on federal government debt. And we do that, of course, with funding that comes from new revenue streams, and quite a lot of them. So a corporate tax rate increase, not for small business, but for large transnationals and larger corporations. Eliminating corporate meal. This is a perfect example as a line item. Just eliminating the tax, the expense deductions for corporations to deduct for meals and entertainment. That comes to $715 million, right? So we get twice as much from eliminating corporations being able to get a Sky Dome box to entertain their clients, which gives them basically, we all pay for that, right? It's not free when you get a corporate expense deduction line item. So that's $715 million right there. There are a lot of places that we can find revenue. Another big one, eliminating fossil fuel subsidies, canceling the Trans Mountain Pipeline. We don't lack for places to find revenue in Canada. Offshore tax havens, going after the companies named and the individuals rather named in the Panama Papers. Anyway, we are always interested in being transparent. Our revenue numbers and our spending numbers are all online. So I'm not worried about where to find the money. The priority is there, and public broadcasting matters to us as Greens.
Thank you very much for that answer. We'll now go to our second question. It's from John in Fort McMurray. His question concerns the Internet advertisement loophole. I believe Ms. May just made a reference to that. John, would you like to ask your question? No, I'm sorry. We've lost John. I will go to the Next question from Sylviane in Bowen Island. Her question concerns the funding models for the CBC. I think we're probably in the same waters here. Sylviane, would you like to ask your question?
Yeah, my name is Sylvain. I'm from Bowen Island, and I would like to say I agree with the principles that Elizabeth just stated. I have an additional revenue source idea that I've noticed the Germans use, which is that over there, everyone who has a receiver, whether it's a radio or a television or perhaps a computer, I'm not sure, pay a fee for having a receiver because they obviously will be receiving public broadcasting with it. And that money is used directly for funding public broadcasters. I think it's extremely important that a public broadcaster, whether it's radio or television or internet parts of that today, are completely independent of commercial interests. I think having any kind of commercials on public broadcasting poisons and slants how programs are made, which programs get on,
Sylviane, I'm going to jump in here and ask you to formulate a question because it's important that we have a question so you can have a precise answer.
Okay. So my question is twofold. One, would the Green Party agree to commercial-free public broadcasting being made possible again? And would they be willing to consider a fee for the users of public broadcasting, similar to Germany, for financing this if they can't find enough money elsewhere?
Madame May?
Thank you, Sylvain, for the question. We absolutely want to move in the direction of commercial free. We're very strongly on holding the line on radio broadcasts. As we know, radio on CBC Radio, Radio-Canada is commercial free. That's not the case for television anymore. The profit motive about CBC having to make money brings us, I think this isn't in the platform, this is my personal opinion, but at the moment that CBC started broadcasting Wheel of Fortune and things like that, you lose the benefit of being a public broadcaster, and you're really competing with the commercial networks for advertising dollars. This is a very flawed model, and at least we think with the $300 million every year, we'll get to a position where at least the news portions of CBC television will no longer have to have commercial breaks. We recognize we have to keep crunching the numbers and making sure that works. As for the idea that's used in Germany of the fee, it's not one that's in our platform. It's not in our budget. We're certainly willing to look at it, but we prefer a model where public broadcasting is secure in its predictable funding model, and that it isn't really on the user, but as an aspect of what government provides. We at this point are looking more at the UK model than the German model.
Thank you very much. Our next question is from Oli in Ottawa. It concerns the tax of big high tech and CanCom. I'm not exactly sure what question that is. Oli, would you like to ask your question, please?
Yes, actually, Mrs. May has already answered it. I was wondering if she was going to tax Facebook and Netflix and Google, and put them on the same footing as our media in not only paying tax here, but also in Canadian content. So she's pretty well answered that. And I just want to say, as one CBC supporter, I have a Green Party lawn sign on my front garden.
Well, I'm going to jump in because that's a big question, and yes, Madam May, you did mention Facebook and the other web giants, but I would like to just ask you to be a little more precise on that question. That is the other big point of contention right now in terms of Canadian media. The fact that Facebook, Google, Amazon, Netflix, etc., are running away with a lot of money without actually paying a cent of sales tax or income tax. Your platform says that you want to close that loophole that exempts them from collecting taxes. What taxes are we talking about exactly, and how would you go about it?
Well, first of all, I really appreciate the question. And I appreciate the lawn sign. We're talking about two different aspects of how the Green Party wants to approach transnational e-commerce companies doing business in Canada. The first piece is closing the loophole. This has been identified by Friends of Public Broadcasting, a loophole by which advertising on Facebook and Google is a better tax deal from our government than advertising in Canadian platforms. That's absolutely outrageous, so we would close that loophole. But we will do more than that. These companies are not our friends, to be quite frank. I mean, Facebook, we can friend Facebook, but Facebook is mining our data for profit. Facebook and Google have a business model which I think is a real threat to democracy and a threat to our independent journalism, whether we're talking about public broadcasting or newspapers. They've eroded the revenue base for newspapers across Canada, and the idea that governments put their advertising on these foreign platforms and let our local newspapers starve for advertising revenue is very concerning. But just sticking to the tax, we will be requiring the foreign vendor, whether it is Netflix, Facebook, Amazon, Google, Airbnb, whatever these foreign platforms, they need to be registered as a foreign vendor, and then they need to register, collect, and remit taxes where the product or service is consumed. They, right now, as was being mentioned earlier, they pay virtually no tax, and they make billions and billions of dollars within Canada. Netflix content also has to have Canadian content. I know that Melanie Joly took quite a while looking at the Netflix issue and ended up with an agreement to give them money to get them to produce Canadian content. But the CRTC rules need to be updated to this virtual reality of competitive media that is not Canadian, not creating jobs in this country, not stimulating our economy. I could go beyond media to talk about what it means when your local bookstore has to compete against Amazon. But just looking at the Google, the Facebook, and the Netflix aspects of e-commerce, they will be taxed as if they were a Canadian company, and we will close the loophole that allows them to have basically an incentive to undermine Canadian advertising.
I'll just like to further that question with you. It seems to me that when we're talking about Facebook, who happens to be, as Danielle said earlier, the number one news outlet for most Canadians right now, we're talking about, giving up a key responsibility in terms of governance. It's a question of Canadian sovereignty, in fact. How do you explain, Madame May, that when the Liberals had the chance with Melanie Joly and Netflix, for example, they totally looked the other way. They let it drop. How do you explain such hesitancy to make American private companies pay?
Madame Pelletier, I am without an explanation. I don't understand it. I can't explain. Neither can I explain Liberals breaking the promise that 2015 would be the last election under first past the post, or that we would be climate leaders. For some reason, because this was so fixable, I may be even more baffled at dropping the ball on what to do about Canadian content in news sources and entertainment sources. Part of it, I think, is that we are, as a society, insufficiently skeptical about a new technology or a new platform when it arrives. We have been tricked into thinking, I believe, that Facebook and Google and all these fun things are just fun. And because they're virtual, they can't be malevolent. I find them malevolent, as well as one should be skeptical. And one needs to bring the CRTC regulations up to speed with a new reality of competition that, as you said in the earlier introduction, Facebook doesn't employ any journalists. And it contributes to fake news. It contributes to an erosion of democracy when we have, and also to invasion of our privacy in a very big way. I mean, when you do a search engine to look for, where's my linkage here? I'm gonna launch my browser. That all goes through Google, and we don't know their algorithms. This is quite chilling stuff. So it's not just it's not fair to Canadian public broadcasting. It's a threat to democracy, and we really need to drill down and come up with the regulations that are required to deal with this different business model.
Thank you for that answer. Before we go to our next question, let's look at our first poll results. The question, the first question to you was, would you change your vote because of a party's position on the CBC and Canadian media? People have answered yes. 82% of people online and listening to us now say yes, they would change their vote because of a party's position on the CBC, and no, 18% would not change their vote. Would you care to say a few words about that, Madame May?
Well, it doesn't surprise me. I mean, and full credit to Friends of Canadian Broadcasting that in the last election, I saw a lot of lawn signs in the nonpartisan campaign. I vote for, I can't remember the rest of it, was I vote for CBC or I vote for public broadcasting. Aligning the concerns in an election campaign to the future of Canadian broadcasting is clearly effective, and I know I think the vast majority of Canadians are fully dedicated. Well, I shouldn't say. I know that some conservatives think that CBC gets too much money and they want to defund CBC, and I would call Andrew Scheer out on that. A society that has a healthy democracy is resilient in a time when we have the threat of populists. I could go on at some length, but I know we have a lot of ground to cover. But the origin of Fox News in the U.S. to move the level of discourse, to move the level of critical thinking substantially into the gutter, that happened when the rules around the Federal Communications Commission in the United States removed the requirement that journalism, whether television, radio, had to be fair and balanced. That was the language. They got rid of that. They brought in Fox News. They moved the political spectrum in the U.S. to the right. Maybe that's why Andrew Scheer doesn't like CBC. We have to protect public broadcasting to have an educated, informed, and critically thinking population across the country.
Thank you. Now, we're about halfway through our telephone town hall with Elizabeth May. There's lots of time still to ask questions, and I have a lot of people waiting to ask questions, so let's go right to it. The next question is from Joy in Victoria about local news. Joy, would you please ask your question?
Yes, I live in BC, but quite often I visit New Brunswick. And I, living in BC, still would like to know what's happening in New Brunswick. And I'd like to know that local news would be across Canada, but still really important issues. Like when I was recently in New Brunswick, I was talking to people in the northern part, and there's arrow spraying to kill deciduous trees there. Now, the paper in New Brunswick is owned by one party, and so the news of that, which is very big, we should be hearing across Canada, and even the people in New Brunswick should be hearing. And I'm wondering if you would ensure that the CBC has journalists everywhere to tackle that thing, those issues.
Thank you, Joy. Madame May.
I want to give you a two-part answer. The first part of that is that we need more funding to CBC so that we can have more journalists, have more local and regional news coverage. The second part is another aspect of our platform on journalism and media. And let me name the name you didn't name. The Irvings own almost all the commercial TV, radio, and they own the newspapers in New Brunswick. And they own the refinery, and they own all the forest operations, and. But they're not the only ones. We've had at the point that 43 newspapers across Canada were bought up by Conrad Black, and then they went to CanWest. When CanWest was in bankruptcy, the receiver in bankruptcy would not let those 43 papers be broken up and sold to people who cared about local journalism. So we lost the London Free Press, we lost the Peterborough Examiner, and so on. So to deal with that vertically integrated media ownership, where you can be in a province without a single independent newspaper in your province, we want to reform the antitrust laws so we can break up media conglomerates so that you have more independent voices. We have competition laws that apply to newspapers, but it turns out that only deals with price fixing. So if the newspapers were all getting together to say we're all going to charge $2 a day for our newspaper, the Competition Act could get at that. But we don't have any laws in this country or any framework of laws that say, I'm sorry, you can't, the Irving family, own all the newspapers in this province. It has to be broken up because that's an antitrust issue. And it's not just New Brunswick, as we know, as I mentioned earlier with what Conrad Black did to our print media in this country. We have to be able to break up media conglomerates to ensure that there are voices based in local happenings and town and city council meetings to keep the local public informed. And, of course, as you mentioned, people across Canada should know if New Brunswick forest practices are killing deciduous trees, which is, of course, part and parcel of why a newspaper owned by the same people who own the forest company don't want to talk about it.
All right. Thank you for your answer, Madam May. We have now an online question from Doris Mack. This is a question: how can we fight global warming without fighting fake news and misinformation? Madam May.
Well, thank you, Doris. That is an excellent question. We have been lied to for decades now. I'm not going to go through my whole history, but I started working on the climate issue when I was in government in the late 80s. And I've often said I was very fortunate to learn my climate science before the myth of doubt was invented. But big oil globally, in a short story, big oil has spent millions and millions of dollars to lie to people to create the impression that there's some sort of scientific debate about whether burning fossil fuels imperils our future. We know it does. Now that we have, on top of what happened right after 1992 and the Earth Summit, that's when these large transnationals making their money out of fossil fuels decided, and not every company did this, but we know the ones that did, putting out propaganda that there was some doubt or it would cost the economy or it wouldn't be allowed. Now we have many more avenues and platforms for this kind of news to be shared. Back in the early 90s, we weren't looking at Facebook ads and algorithms and abilities to match what looked like real news sites and fill them with misinformation. So we do have to get at this. We also have to recognize that CBC needs to have dedicated journalists who understand the climate crisis. Back when we signed the Framework Convention on Climate Change in 1992, I don't know how many people on this telephone town hall will now nod their heads in the memory. She's alive, but she used to be the nonstop voice of climate science and information on the environment. Eve Savory was the dedicated CBC correspondent, and she knew this issue in depth and detail. Now I hear CBC, I won't say who it is, but well-known folks on CBC, when we talk about the importance of avoiding 2 degrees Celsius global average temperature increase, I've heard major national voices refer to it as 2%. Now, Eve Savory knew her stuff. CBC needs to have the resources to hire the kinds of full-time, deeply well-informed, technical experts who are also good communicators to make sure that CBC coverage on the climate crisis doesn't, drop down to a level that would pass muster as a local commercial station. That's just not good enough. So we call for more funding for CBC to have a specialized reporter, as they used to have, and to make sure that we go after those sites that are promoting and allowing false information to contaminate the public discourse.
Thank you, Madam May. I'm just going to ask you. I think no one would argue that we need to have good reporters doing good reporting on specific issues, but the whole question of the social media still remains. As Daniel said, none of them have a legal obligation to tell the truth. That is a big problem in terms of our own democracy, not just in Canada but everywhere. How do you foresee us tackling that problem? What can we do?
Well, I did actually, one of my nonpartisan members of Parliament newsletters very recently this year was on the problem of fake news, and particularly heading into this election. There are some things each one of us can do in terms of, I think it goes without question, that the people who are on this call are and want to participate in this town hall are among the best educated and most committed to factual information and good journalism. What I adopted in this it was the May 2019 newsletter. I think you can maybe still find it online. I'm not sure if during the election my nonpartisan website is down. But in looking at it, there have been a number of good steps suggested. One thing is when you see something online and you suspect it's not true, go to the source. Try to find if there's a reputable journalistic source behind any story you see on Facebook. And if you track it down to a site that's meant to look like a real news site but definitely isn't, warn people on Facebook, this is not a real news story. This is not an acceptable source. There was a recent conference of political scientists in Quebec who came up with tools for the informed citizen. It was at University of Laval, and they came up with something called the 30 seconds rule. So if you see something online, look at the source, where is it coming from, take 30 seconds to decide if you want to retweet it or share it with your friends. Dig in and warn other people when you find something that is clearly propaganda without evidence. If it's a difference of opinion, that's one thing, but propaganda without evidence is very, very dangerous. And this 30-second rule will help us do this election. After the election, I certainly hope to have the capacity, as a lot of Greens in Parliament, to be able to change the rules around which Facebook operates in Canada to ensure that that they root out things that are designed to promote hate speech. I mean, that's another thing we haven't touched on yet. It's designed to increase Islamophobia or anti-Semitism. Access to this kind of, forgive the word, it's just filth. We should not be having that accessible. And the reason that these social media platforms get away with this is that they're not considered publishing. They're considered platforms, so they're neutral as to content. I think we need to define them as publishers, so they have to meet the same standards of responsibility for what gets posted on them as they would have to do if they were the Ottawa Citizen or the Victoria Times Colonist.
Thank you very much for that answer, Madame May. Just a reminder before we go to our next questions that you can push *3 to speak to an operator and present your question. Pour les francophones à l'écoute, appuyez l'étoile et le numéro 3 pour poser vos questions à Madame May. Our next question is a question online from Francine. No, not online. Oh, I'm sorry. Our next question comes from Francine, mon homonyme, in Sainte-Perpétue de Lillet. Will Greens remove CBC ads? Francine, do you want to ask your question?
Oui, Francine de Montigny-Pelletier, journaliste aussi, pigiste pour l'instant dans l'information locale, et j'ai travaillé auparavant comme bénévole pour les médias autochtones, radio communautaire, de même que revues et journaux. Et écoutez, écoutez, j'aurais 4-5 questions, mais je vais me résumer là. Mais justement, je me demandais si le Parti vert allait éliminer toute publicité. Je suis vraiment désolée parce que j'ai perdu contact un peu. J'ai peut-être pas tout entendu précédemment.
Je vous interromps, madame,
oui.
parce que Madame May a déjà répondu à cette question-là.
Bon,
puis comme vous en avez plusieurs, je vous encourage à aller à la seconde.
Moi, par rapport au rôle du CRTC, j'ai été choquée récemment. J'ai fait 2 plaintes au CRTC récemment, dont une parce que j'ai vu plusieurs fois au bulletin de nouvelles de Radio-Canada sur télé, par Internet. J'ai vu plusieurs fois, et parfois c'était 2 ou 3 fois à l'intérieur de l'heure du bulletin de nouvelles du soir, des publicités provenant de quelque chose comme Canadian for Canada Development, et c'était évidemment payé par des pétrolières juste avant que ne commence la campagne électorale. Et je me suis demandé, mais comment le CRTC pouvait permettre de telles choses? C'était des publicités qui étaient non seulement agressives, mais vraiment, c'était qui disaient qu'on avait comme des complots de personnes étrangères qui payaient les personnes qui étaient écologistes au Canada. Je n'en revenais juste pas. J'ai fait aussi une plainte au CRTC parce que sur des postes de Cogeco, on a eu des propos belliqueux et racistes envers les Mohawks, pour les nommer.
Oui, alors, est-ce que vous pouvez poser la question
le
plus
rôle
précisément?
du CRTC dans tout ça? Parce que le CRTC, quand on se
plaint... Je vous remercie, je laisse Mme May répondre. Merci.
D'accord, oui.
Merci, Francine. Merci aussi pour votre travail comme bénévole pour le journalisme, pour une communauté autochtone. C'est vraiment important. Nous n'avons pas touché sur les questions des Autochtones et les droits des Autochtones, mais merci. Alors, je suis absolument d'accord que le CRTC va faire plus pour régler les publicités comme ça. C'est vraiment, je suis aussi choquée par ça. Maintenant, comme j'ai dit déjà, on doit mettre sur pied une approche plus moderne à la mode du défi, des menaces, des plateformes de médias sociaux. On doit faire une autre approche et protéger les sources de journalisme de notre CBC et Radio-Canada particulièrement, mais il y a des autres aussi où les mensonges qui sont partagés par les plateformes de médias sociaux, on doit faire une autre approche et régler comme les autres sources de médias.
Thank you. Merci, Madame May. Before we go to more questions, it's time for our second poll question. This is the question: if the CBC had more money, how would you like to see it spent? Press 1 for local services. Press 2 for international news. Press 3 for fiction programming. And press 4 for digital services. I repeat the question. If the CBC had more money, how would you like to see it spent? 1, local services. 2, international news. 3, fiction programming. Or 4, digital services. Now, to continue with our telephone town hall, this is Beverly in Comox, who would like to ask a question: what will happen if there is no I can't read the writing. No extra money for the CBC. Madame May, what will happen to the CBC?
Well, thanks to Beverly and Comox, I think we all know the answer. If we allow CBC to continue to be starved for funds, the quality of broadcasting will continue to fall, and it's not their fault. Obviously, it's one of the most, if not it's the most poorly funded of public broadcasters in the industrialized world compared to other countries. It's not acceptable. I think we've all been concerned for some considerable time that CBC was being starved, and certainly in the Harper era, and certainly Mr. Scheer's policies and the comments made by conservatives in the House of Commons, I know it's very clear that they don't see public broadcasting as a priority. You starve something long enough, it will die. and that's why we need to provide $300 million a year every year until we have the right level of per capita funding to be the equivalent of what the BBC gets from the UK.
Thank you. Before I go to Anthony in Toronto, let me just remind people that everyone on the call at right now can leave a voice message for Elizabeth May. If you don't get a chance to ask your question live on air, or if you aren't comfortable asking your question live, you can wait to the end of our telephone town hall and leave a message for Green Party leader Elizabeth May. Now, Anthony in Toronto has a question on diversity.
Yes,
Anthony.
Hi, thank you. Thanks for the opportunity to ask the question. So, Ms. May, you made a comment after the photos of the Prime Minister came out last week, wearing blackface and brownface, that you thought that Canadians should focus on the more important issues in this election. And I was just wondering, given that comment, what your views are on the need for diversity and representation in on-air talent and in production staff as well within the CBC.
Thank you, Anthony. Let me hasten to reassure you I never made such a comment.
Is that your answer? So shall I go, or would you like to add
I
something?
don't know if Anthony wants to add anything further. I can certainly say that my views on diversity and the Green Party, I haven't spoken much about what the Green Party stands for globally. We exist in 80 countries around the world, so we're the only truly global party, which I think is important when fighting issues and challenges like the climate crisis. We have 6 core green values, and one of them is respect for diversity. So while climate change and the climate crisis represent an existential threat to our survival, I didn't make any comment that suggested that Canadians paying attention to the fact of the discovery that was very shocking that Justin Trudeau had in the past and several times engaged in activity that could only be called racist. I think we all have to examine, particularly those of us of privilege, and anyone who by the color of their skin has privilege. In other words, everybody who's Caucasian has privilege, whether you're struggling to make ends meet or not. We have to recognize and unpack the levels of intersectionality, the levels of privilege, the fact that some people shrug their shoulders. I've been astonished to find people who thought it really was not significant to find that the Prime Minister had applied brownface or blackface for entertainment purposes, and the damage that does harm. It particularly does harm to people of color, to their children. It's not something to be brushed aside.
Thank you. Our next question comes from Nancy in Comox, BC, concerning the financing of journalism. Nancy, would you like to ask your question, please?
Yes, thank you. I'm actually in Saanich in Ms. May's riding. Ms. May, you've touched on aspects of this, but I would be interested in the Green Party's position or your personal position in what can be done to support our struggling independent journalism, especially the print media.
Thank you, Nancy. I'm at the McTavish Center for the Arts if you want to run over and join us before this birthday party is over. But in any case, we are and I'm very concerned as an individual, the party as an organization, all of our candidates are very concerned about the nature of struggling journalism, our newspapers across the country. We can't allow our newspapers to become essentially McPapers that carry all the same news cut and chopped in. One thing is the Government of Canada should never put its advertising dollars in anything other than Canadian sources of Canadian media, not in the social media platforms that are starving the traditional media of their advertising revenue. And we need to make sure that we bring in the antitrust laws to break up media conglomerates so that individual newspapers owned and operated locally can meet the needs of a local community. From the beginning of, if you go back to the Kent Commission, I don't know how many of you online remember the Tom Kent Commission looking at journalism in Canada, and that was in, I think, the 1970s, and saying it's reaching a crisis point. That was before Conrad Black started buying up papers and creating vertically integrated media conglomerates. One of Conrad Black's great lines was, he said, a mistake people make when they're running a newspaper is to think they need to pay for reporters. So we are very dedicated to independent journalism, to good reporting, and to knowing that the more newspapers a person reads, the more literate they are in being an effective citizen. The average Swede reads 4 and 5 and 6 newspapers a day, knowing that some of them are right-wing, some of them are left-wing, and when the time they've finished reading the newspaper, even Swedish teenagers read many different newspapers every single day, and we are at a significant risk for our democracy by allowing that full range of journalistic voices to be viable economically.
Thank you, Madam May. Now let me apprise you of the results of our second poll question. The question was, if the CBC had more money, how would you like to see it spent? And overwhelmingly, the majority of listeners, 53%, would like the money seen spent on international news, 40% on local services, a mere 4% on fiction programming, and an even smaller percentage, 3%, on digital services. So the answer to that question was 53% would like to see more international news, 40% more local services or news, 4% fiction, more fiction, 3% digital services. Since we still have many questions, let me read this online question from Brian. The CBC has a broad mandate, including news, sports, etc. Should that mandate be narrowed, Madame May?
Brian, you've asked me a question for which I don't have a policy answer from the Green Party. Our policies are derived from votes of our congresses, of our members gathered together in general meeting. The narrowing of the mandate honestly isn't something that I've ever considered. I just give you my personal view that I think the biggest priority is news and journalism and keeping Canadians well informed. So I'd certainly be open to reviewing the mandate question, but I also don't know if Friends of Canadian Broadcasting has taken a position on this. I'd certainly be interested in knowing the answer to that. But thank you for asking a thought-provoking question.
Another thought-provoking question from Pamela Russell. This is on Twitter. I will read it. You've said, Madam May, that you will support any party to form a government if they accept your priorities. Is the defense of media and democracy part of that, your priorities? Madam May.
Thanks, Pamela. And the way you put it isn't exactly how we look at it. In a minority parliament, and as I said, in the Greens around the world, I have many colleagues who have real-life experience, including the leader of the Green Party of BC here, Andrew Weaver, in figuring out what you do, how you negotiate, what the best result is in a minority parliament to serve best the public interest. There will be, of course, no vote of confidence in any government after this election from the Greens, depending on how many members we have and if we hold what we call the balance of responsibility and others call the balance of power, that does not make ensuring our children have a livable world and ensure that we don't go above 1.5 degrees Celsius, which means a commitment to going off fossil fuels as quickly as possible. There are other priorities. I'd say probably next in line is electoral reform and getting rid of the first-past-the-post system. Ensuring that we have a healthy democracy requires a healthy media, journalism, independent voices, holding government's feet to the fire. It's a high priority, but I can't at this point, because I want to always keep an open hand to how we negotiate after an election in a minority parliament. I can tell you this, Pamela, we will give no one a blank check based on one or two promises up front. I think we need to make sure that in a minority parliament it functions much more the way the Liberal minority under Lester B. Pearson functioned back when the NDP had a smallish group of seats but made all the difference in the world in bringing in our healthcare system, Canadian pension plan. There was no formal coalition, no formal signing off on a blank check, but a lot more was accomplished vote by vote.
Thank you, Madam May. Now we have a question from Harvey Scott in Alberta about investigative journalism. Mr. Scott, would you like to ask?
Hello?
Yes, please, Mr. Scott, go ahead. Ask your question, please.
Yes, and it's been spoken to in various different ways, directly, indirectly. But it's been my impression over the last few decades, particularly with the Mulroney government and more recently with the Harper government, that the CBC has been essentially neutered in terms of doing really good, critical, investigative journalism. Now, there are some exceptions, and you, with Fifth Estate and Mr. McKeon and all those folks are still doing it. But by and large, I think the CBC has had its wings clipped and told not to go into those sensitive areas about capitalism and so on. So I guess my question to Ms. May is whether it's in terms of governance, changing the governance model, et cetera, what could you do if you had influence after the election with changing CBC's mandate as governance and so on, so it can get back to the days that I recall as an octogenarian of it being the source of really good investigative journalism.
Thank you. And
yes.
me.
Yes. Thank you, Mr. Scott. Absolutely. The twin parts of our platform that speak to this are, of course, that we would increase funding to CBC so it was capable of doing excellent journalism. And I don't want to act like CBC these days doesn't do excellent journalism. There are still wonderful reporters and wonderful journalists doing extremely good work, but the quality and the resources to do it has been significantly reduced. I think $300 million a year will make it's tripling the per capita analysis of what CBC receives, but that won't be enough if you can have a government appointing people who are ideologically aligned with that government to the board of directors of CBC Radio-Canada. So we need to reform that governance structure to remove any potential for political interference in board appointments. And I think those two things taken together, there's been another aspect what I'll mention is maybe it's a thought chill problem. There's been a sense that I had during the Harper years that CBC was self-censoring to avoid further cuts. That didn't help them. The ideology of the Harper administration was to be going after CBC, even if CBC produced journalism hoping that Stephen Harper might like it. I don't think that's worked. But in any case, getting political interference out of board appointments is quite critical, as well as additional funding.
Let me just further ask you to further that thought with a very last question, and this will be, unfortunately, the last question to Ms. May for our town hall. Ms. May, your platform is quite enticing in drawing the picture of a futurist Canada, of Canada in 2030, where there would be a lot of things changed for the better. How do you see the CBC in the future? What is the CBC of your imagination at its best in the future?
Well, Francine, that's a wonderful question. Actually, we do in that evocative image-making beginning of the platform say, if you had a jigsaw puzzle and it's brand new and all the pieces are in front of you, you won't know how to put that together if you don't have the top of the box. So we think our platform is the top of the box. In that vision of CBC Radio-Canada in 2030, we can't begin to imagine now how the digital era may affect how we receive our information. But however we're receiving it, we need strong, brilliant, independent, nonpartisan journalism to deliver to us honest information about what the rest of the world is experiencing. And I also would say what our local town councils are doing, as well as what our provincial and federal governments are doing. Information, honest journalism, and a real challenge to power in let's just call it what it used to be called muckraking journalism is essential. So in the future, whether we're receiving our information on little tiny gizmos we can't now imagine, the voice of Canadian news and information and excellence in journalism should be our CBC et aussi sur les plateformes de Radio-Canada et toutes les choses que Radio-Canada fait maintenant je pense que maintenant Radio-Canada a plus d'excellence dans ces émissions télévisionnées parce que les segments sont plus longs. So I do think that when I watch Radio-Canada, I have a larger sense that the stories are more detailed because they're not clipped down to 1 minute. They still can go 3 minutes. But in the future, regardless of our technology, public broadcasting, Canadian broadcasting, should be well enough funded that we actually are well-informed citizens.
Thank you for that, Madame May, and thank you very much for joining us today. I want to remind everyone that you can still leave a voice message for Madame May once the call is complete. If you didn't get a chance to take your question, you can wait to the end and leave a message for Green Party leader Elizabeth May. So that was the second installment of Friends of Canadian Broadcasting, the 2019 Leaders Series. Will there be a third? Stay tuned. Answers from both Liberal Party leader Justin Trudeau and Conservative Party leader Andrew Scheer are still pending. We'll keep you apprised. And if you haven't already, go to friends.ca and sign up for the mailing list so you will be notified of all the details by email. That's all for now. I'm Francine Pelletier. Thank you for joining us. Merci à tous ceux et à toutes celles qui ont participé à ce forum. Bonne soirée.